Napoleon Bonaparte's story begins on the rugged island of Corsica, a land known for its fierce independence and deep mistrust of outsiders. He was born on August 15, 1769, in the town of Ajaccio, just months after France formally took control of the island from the Republic of Genoa. This timing meant that Napoleon grew up with both Corsican pride and a strong awareness of being under foreign rule, something that would fuel his ambition for power and greatness. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer and a political figure who once supported Corsican independence before pledging loyalty to France. His mother, Letizia Ramolino, was a strict but resilient woman who instilled in her children discipline and endurance. The young Napoleon grew up in a large family of 8 surviving siblings, often described as serious, introverted, and fiercely determined, even as a child. At just 9 years old, Napoleon left Corsica for mainland France, where he entered a military academy at Brienne-le-Château. He spoke French with a heavy Corsican accent and was often mocked by his classmates. This humiliation only sharpened his drive to excel. He threw himself into studies of mathematics, history, and, most importantly, military strategy. By the time he graduated from the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, Napoleon had already set his sights on greatness. Even as a teenager, he showed signs of his destiny. He wrote about his dreams of glory, of lifting himself and his family out of obscurity. To him, the army was not just a career, but a path to power. He once said as a young man, "I felt that I was destined to do great things." From his Corsican roots and difficult childhood, Napoleon carried forward 2 qualities that would define his life: an unyielding will to rise above his circumstances and a relentless hunger for power and recognition. The world did not yet know it, but the boy from Corsica was preparing to change the course of history.
When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, Napoleon was just 20 years old, a young artillery officer brimming with ambition. France was in chaos. The monarchy had collapsed. New ideas of liberty and equality were sweeping the nation, and the old order of Europe was preparing to crush revolutionary France. For ambitious men like Napoleon, this turmoil created a unique opportunity. He first distinguished himself in 1793 during the Siege of Toulon, a port city that had rebelled against a republic and invited British forces to occupy it. While most officers hesitated, Napoleon developed a daring plan to place artillery in key positions, cutting off the British fleet. His strategy worked brilliantly. Toulon fell, and Napoleon, barely in his 20s, was promoted to brigadier general. It was his first major step toward greatness. But his rise was not without setbacks. After the fall of Robespierre in 1794, Napoleon briefly lost his position and was even arrested. For months he lived in uncertainty, with his career hanging by a thread. Yet his resilience never wavered. He waited for his chance. And when Paris itself came under threat from royalist rebels in 1795, he seized it. In what became known as the whiff of grape shot, Napoleon ordered his cannons to fire directly into the advancing mob. The brutal efficiency of his response saved the government, and in return, he was rewarded with fame and command of the Army of Italy. By his mid-20s, Napoleon was no longer just a young Corsican outsider. He was a rising star of revolutionary France, feared by his enemies and admired by his soldiers. In the storm of the revolution, he had proven his brilliance, his ruthlessness, and his destiny for even greater power. In 1793, France was under siege from both inside and outside. The port city of Toulon had rebelled against the revolutionary government and invited British and Spanish fleets to take control. For the Republic, losing Toulon meant losing its navy in the Mediterranean. Amid this crisis, a young and little-known artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte stepped forward. Only 24 years old, he was placed in charge of the artillery. Where others saw an impossible situation, Napoleon saw opportunity. He studied the terrain with precision and proposed a daring plan: place batteries on high ground to cut off the British fleet's supply lines and force them out of the harbor. His superiors reluctantly agreed. Napoleon worked tirelessly, moving cannons through mud and hills, directing fire with unmatched energy. When the plan was executed, his artillery rained destruction on the enemy fleet. The British and their allies could no longer hold Toulon. They evacuated, burning ships as they fled. The victory was decisive, and it was Napoleon's strategy that made it possible. Overnight, he became the hero of Toulon, earning a promotion to brigadier general. For the first time, the world caught a glimpse of his military genius. Toulon was not just a battle won, it was the moment Napoleon began his unstoppable ascent toward power.
In 1796, at just 26 years old, Napoleon Bonaparte took command of the Army of Italy. What he found was a starving, demoralized force, poorly supplied and ignored by Paris. But Napoleon saw potential where others saw ruin. Addressing his men, he declared, "Soldiers, you are naked and ill-fed. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power." With fiery words and bold vision, he transformed their despair into determination. Facing the larger and better-equipped Austrian and Piedmontese armies, Napoleon relied on speed, precision, and psychology. Instead of fighting conventionally, he divided his enemies, striking each force separately before they could unite. His mantra was simple: divide and conquer. In battle after battle, Montenotte, Lodi, Arcole, Rivoli, he stunned Europe. At Lodi, he personally led a charge across a bridge under heavy fire, cementing his legend among his soldiers. At Arcole, carrying a flag, he plunged into the fray to rally his men. Within a single year, Napoleon turned Italy from Austrian dominance into French control. He secured immense wealth for France, glory for his soldiers, and a reputation as a genius of modern warfare. The Italian campaign was not only a string of victories, it was the moment Napoleon proved he was more than a general. He was a man destined to reshape Europe.
By 1798, Napoleon's ambition had outgrown Italy. His eyes turned to Egypt, a land of ancient wonders and strategic importance. Seizing it would strike at Britain's trade routes to India and expand French influence far beyond Europe. With 35,000 men, he set sail, not only with soldiers, but also with scientists, engineers, and scholars. This was no ordinary conquest. It was an expedition of both war and knowledge. The French studied the pyramids, mapped the Nile, and unearthed treasures of antiquity. Among their discoveries was the Rosetta Stone, the key to unlocking the language of ancient Egypt. On land, Napoleon's brilliance shone once again. At the Battle of the Pyramids, he faced the fearsome Mamluk cavalry. With disciplined squares of infantry and devastating artillery, he crushed them, securing Cairo and the Nile Valley. Standing before his men, he famously declared, "Soldiers, from the top of these pyramids,
40 centuries looked down upon you. But his glory was short-lived. At sea, the British Navy under Admiral Nelson struck at Abu Qir Bay in the Battle of the Nile. The French fleet was annihilated, cutting Napoleon off from France. The campaign turned into isolation, hardship, and disease. Though he returned to France in 1799 as a hero in the public eye, the Egyptian campaign revealed both the heights of Napoleon's vision and the vulnerability of his ambitions. By 1799, France was exhausted. The revolution had descended into instability, corruption, and endless wars. The ruling Directory was weak and unpopular, clinging to power while the people longed for order. Into this chaos stepped Napoleon, fresh from Egypt, already a national hero. His allies, including Emmanuel Sieyès, conspired to overthrow the Directory. On 9 November 1799, known in the revolutionary calendar as the 18th of Brumaire, Napoleon made his move. He first summoned the Council of Ancients and Council of 500, the two legislative bodies of France, claiming there was a Jacobin conspiracy threatening the Republic. Soldiers loyal to him surrounded the councils, creating an atmosphere of fear and confusion. Inside, chaos erupted. Some deputies denounced him as a traitor, others fled in panic. When Napoleon himself entered the Council of 500, he was met with shouts of "Outlaw him!" His life was in danger until his brother, Lucien Bonaparte, the council's president, rallied the guards outside. French grenadiers stormed the chamber, dispersing the assembly by force. The Directory was dissolved. In its place, a new government was established, the Consulate, with Napoleon as first consul. In a single stroke, Napoleon had ended the revolution and replaced it with his own rule. It was not yet an empire, but the stage was set. France now had a strong leader, and the world had a new master of power.
As first consul of France, Napoleon quickly proved that he was more than a soldier. He was a masterful statesman. From 1799 onward, he reshaped France with reforms that brought stability after years of revolution and bloodshed. He centralized power, streamlining government to make it efficient and loyal to him. He reformed taxation, balancing the budget and ensuring that money flowed directly into the state. He founded the Bank of France, stabilizing the economy and restoring trust in French currency. Napoleon also sought to heal divisions within the nation. In 1801, he signed the Concordat with the Pope, restoring Catholicism as the religion of the majority while maintaining religious tolerance and state supremacy. This move appeased the faithful without surrendering power. His most lasting achievement, however, was the Napoleonic Code. This legal framework abolished feudal privileges, established equality before the law, and protected property rights. Though authoritarian in some aspects, it became the foundation of modern legal systems worldwide. Through reforms in education, administration, and law, Napoleon created a France that was orderly, prosperous, and loyal to him. He wasn't just ruling by the sword, he was ruling by organization, vision, and control. By the early 1800s, Napoleon was no longer simply a revolutionary general. He was the architect of a new France, consolidating power with every step. The title of First Consul was only the beginning of his imperial ambition.
Among all of Napoleon's achievements, none left a deeper mark than the Napoleonic Code of 1804. After years of revolution and chaos, France's laws were a patchwork of local traditions, feudal customs, and revolutionary decrees. Napoleon sought order, a single, unified system of justice for all. The code swept away the remnants of feudalism. It enshrined equality before the law, the abolition of privileges by birth, and the protection of property rights. Contracts were to be honored, civil marriage and divorce were established, and merit, not bloodline, became the basis for advancement. Yet, the code also reflected Napoleon's conservative side. While men gained clear rights as heads of households, women lost many of the freedoms they had briefly enjoyed during the Revolution. Authority in the family was firmly patriarchal, showing that Napoleon's vision of order often came at the cost of liberty. Despite its limits, the Napoleonic Code spread far beyond France. As Napoleon's armies marched across Europe, they carried the code with them, replacing centuries-old laws in Italy, the Netherlands, parts of Germany, and Poland. Even after his fall, the code endured, becoming the foundation of legal systems across Europe, Latin America, and beyond. Today, traces of Napoleon's laws still govern millions of people worldwide. More than battles or crowns, it was this code that secured his place as one of history's great lawmakers.
On December 2, 1804, the Grand Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris was transformed into a spectacle of power. The Pope himself, Pius VII, had traveled from Rome to crown Napoleon Bonaparte as Emperor of the French. It was meant to be the ultimate symbol of legitimacy, the Church blessing the rise of a new ruler. But Napoleon had his own plan. As the moment approached, instead of kneeling before the Pope, Napoleon seized the crown with his own hands and placed it upon his head. Then, in a dramatic gesture, he crowned his wife, Josephine, as Empress. The message was clear. Napoleon owed his authority to no one, not the Pope, not the old monarchies of Europe. His power came from himself and from France. This act shocked traditionalists and thrilled his supporters. In one motion, he broke centuries of precedent. The revolution had ended kingship, but Napoleon had reinvented it on his own terms. The coronation was not just a ceremony, it was a declaration. France was no longer a republic in chaos, it was an empire. And at its center stood Napoleon, master of his destiny and challenger of the old world order.
On December 2, 1805, exactly 1 year after his coronation, Napoleon faced the might of Europe at Austerlitz. The combined armies of Russia's Tsar Alexander I and Austria's Emperor Francis II vastly outnumbered him. Many believed Napoleon was cornered at last, but Napoleon had carefully crafted the battlefield. He appeared weak, deliberately abandoning the high ground to lure his enemies into overconfidence. When the coalition forces attacked his seemingly exposed flank, Napoleon unleashed his trap. At the center, hidden reserves struck with devastating force, splitting the enemy lines in two. The French army, outnumbered, shattered two empires in a single day. Over 30,000 coalition troops were killed, wounded, or captured. The frozen lakes of Austerlitz, where soldiers drowned under collapsing ice, became a chilling symbol of the battle's destruction. The victory was so complete that it forced Austria out of the war and made Napoleon the undisputed master of Europe. Soldiers hailed it as his masterpiece, the perfect display of deception, timing, and audacity. Austerlitz was not just a battle. It was the moment Napoleon reached the peak of his power, his empire stretching across Europe, his genius unquestioned. To his enemies, he was no longer just a French general. He was the greatest strategist of his age.
After Austerlitz, Napoleon's influence spread like wildfire across Europe. Defeated monarchies were forced to sign treaties, and entire nations were reshaped under his will. France was no longer just a country. It was the center of a vast empire. Napoleon placed his family on thrones to secure his power. His brother Joseph became King of Naples and later King of Spain. Louis ruled Holland. Jerome was made King of Westphalia, a newly created German kingdom. Even his stepson, Eugene de Beauharnais, governed Italy. Everywhere, Napoleon's dynasty extended its reach. Beyond family rule, Napoleon reorganized Europe into client states loyal to France. The Confederation of the Rhine replaced the old Holy Roman Empire. The Kingdom of Italy, the Duchy of Warsaw, and other Napoleonic creations spread his laws and reforms across the continent. But this expansion was more than political domination. Napoleon exported the Napoleonic Code, abolishing feudal privileges, promoting merit, and reshaping societies in his image. To many, he was a liberator who destroyed the old aristocratic order. To others, he was a conqueror who imposed French rule by force. By 1810, Napoleon's empire stretched from Spain to Poland, with allies in Austria, Prussia, and even Russia, at least temporarily. Europe had not seen such dominance since the days of Rome. But this vast reach carried seeds of rebellion and resistance that would one day turn against him.
While Napoleon ruled most of Europe on land, one power still defied him: Great Britain. Protected by its navy and fueled by global trade, Britain remained the biggest obstacle to his dominance. Since defeating him at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, the British fleet ensured France could not invade the island. So Napoleon turned to a different kind of weapon: economic warfare. In 1806, he announced the Continental System, a blockade designed to cut Britain off from European markets. All of Napoleon's allies and client states were ordered to stop trading with Britain, closing ports from Lisbon to St. Petersburg. On paper, it was a brilliant idea. Without access to Europe, Britain's economy would collapse. Factories would shut down, workers would starve, and eventually Britain would sue for peace. But in practice, it was far harder to enforce. Britain's navy still controlled the seas, allowing them to trade with the Americas, India, and beyond. Smugglers thrived, sneaking British goods into Europe. Even Napoleon's allies, like Spain, Portugal, and eventually Russia, grew frustrated by the system as it strangled their economies too. Instead of crippling Britain, the blockade ended up weakening Napoleon's own empire. Shortages of colonial goods like sugar, coffee, and tobacco hurt Europeans. The black market grew stronger than ever, and resentment spread in regions forced to follow Napoleon's decree. The Continental System showed Napoleon's genius for thinking big, but also his limits. He could dominate land battles, but Britain's control of the sea meant his blockade could never truly succeed. In 1808, Napoleon turned his eyes to the Iberian Peninsula, aiming to tighten his control over Europe by overthrowing the Spanish monarchy and enforcing the Continental System in Portugal. At first, his armies swept through with ease, capturing Madrid and installing his brother Joseph Bonaparte as king. But Napoleon underestimated the spirit of the Spanish people. Across villages, towns, and cities, ordinary citizens rose up in fierce guerrilla warfare, a term that originates from this very conflict, meaning little war. Farmers, priests, and townsfolk ambushed French patrols, cut off supply lines, and made life miserable for the occupying forces. Meanwhile, Britain seized the opportunity to strike back at Napoleon. Under commanders like Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, British troops landed in Portugal and supported the Spanish resistance. Together, they inflicted repeated defeats on the French. The Peninsular War became a bleeding wound for Napoleon's empire. His armies were tied down in endless skirmishes, morale plummeted, and thousands of men were drained from other crucial fronts. What he had thought would be a quick conquest turned into a 6-year nightmare. Napoleon himself admitted that Spain was his ulcer, a small wound that grew worse with time, sapping his strength and weakening his empire from within.
By 1812, Napoleon stood at the height of his power, ruling or dominating nearly all of continental Europe. But one ally defied him, Russia, under Tsar Alexander I. The Tsar resisted the Continental System, reopening trade with Britain. For Napoleon, this was not just defiance, it was betrayal. Determined to bring Russia to heel, he launched one of the most ambitious military campaigns in history. In June 1812, the Grande Armée, nearly 600,000 soldiers strong, crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory. It was the largest army Europe had ever seen, a multinational force drawn from across Napoleon's empire. But the Russians refused to meet him in a decisive battle. Instead, they employed a scorched earth strategy, retreating deeper into their vast lands, burning crops and villages, denying Napoleon's troops food and shelter. The French advanced further, but the land offered nothing in return. At last, in September, the two sides clashed at the Battle of Borodino. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the era. Tens of thousands fell in a single day. Though the French claimed victory, it was Pyrrhic, with no decisive outcome. When Napoleon entered Moscow, he expected surrender. Instead, the city burned. The Russians had abandoned and destroyed it, leaving him with no supplies, no shelter, and no peace terms. Winter came early. Hunger, disease, and freezing cold ravaged the Grande Armée. Harassed constantly by Russian forces, the once mighty army crumbled during its desperate retreat. By the time Napoleon staggered back to friendly territory, fewer than 100,000 men remained. The invasion of Russia marked the turning point of Napoleon's fortunes. His aura of invincibility was shattered, and Europe sensed that the giant could bleed.
After the catastrophe in Russia, Napoleon's once unshakable empire began to unravel. His enemies sensed weakness, and the coalition against him grew stronger. Prussia, Austria, Britain, Russia, and other nations united with renewed determination to end his dominance. Napoleon tried to rebuild his forces quickly, raising new armies from France's youth. But these recruits lacked the experience and cohesion of the veterans who had perished in the snow of Russia. Meanwhile, his former allies turned against him. States that once bowed to his power now saw a chance for freedom. In 1813, the German campaign reached its climax at the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations. It was the largest battle in Europe before World War I, with more than 600,000 soldiers clashing. Despite his brilliance, Napoleon was overwhelmed. His army was crushed, and the coalition marched toward France. As his forces dwindled, even his closest allies abandoned him. The Confederation of the Rhine dissolved, and many German states defected. Spain, long drained by guerrilla warfare, slipped from his control. One by one, the pillars of his empire collapsed. By 1814, coalition armies invaded France itself. Napoleon fought desperately in the 6 Days Campaign, showing flashes of his old genius, but it was not enough. Paris fell, and the once great emperor was forced to abdicate. The decline of Napoleon was swift and dramatic, from ruler of nearly all Europe to exile on the tiny island of Elba. Yet even in defeat, the world had not heard the last of him.
In 1814, after his abdication, Napoleon was exiled to the small Mediterranean island of Elba, just off the coast of Italy. For many, this seemed like the end of his story. The once mighty emperor of the French was reduced to ruling a tiny island with a few thousand inhabitants. Yet Napoleon did not wallow in defeat. On Elba, he reorganized the local government,
improved agriculture, and even designed new roads. His restless energy never faded. But he watched events in France closely. The restored Bourbon monarchy under King Louis XVIII was deeply unpopular, and dissatisfaction spread among the people and the army. Napoleon saw his chance. In February 1815, in an audacious move, he escaped Elba with just a few hundred loyal soldiers. When he landed in France, royal troops were sent to stop him. Instead of fleeing, Napoleon walked directly toward them, unarmed, and declared, "Here I am. Kill your emperor if you wish." The soldiers, instead of arresting him, erupted in cheers, "Vive l'Empereur!" They joined him, and his army grew with every step. What followed became known as the 100 Days, a breathtaking return to power. Napoleon marched triumphantly into Paris, greeted by the people, while Louis XVIII fled. Once again, Europe trembled as Napoleon prepared for one final clash against the coalition.
Napoleon's return to power in 1815 was nothing short of astonishing. In just 3 weeks, he marched from Elba to Paris, rallying soldiers and citizens to his side. The Bourbon monarchy collapsed without a fight, and once again, Napoleon stood at the head of France. But the world would not stand idle. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia quickly formed a new coalition to bring him down once and for all. Napoleon knew he had little time. His empire was fragile, his resources stretched thin, and many allies had deserted him. Still, his genius for strategy burned as brightly as ever. He believed that a swift strike into Belgium could divide the British and Prussian forces before they fully united. If he could win quickly, he might secure his throne once more. Thus began the 100 Days, Napoleon's desperate bid for glory. His presence alone electrified his men, veterans who still remembered the victories of Italy, Austerlitz, and Jena. They marched with renewed fire, determined to fight under the banner of the eagle one last time. But destiny would bring Napoleon to Waterloo, where the fate of Europe would be decided in a single monumental clash.
June 18, 1815. The fields near the small Belgian village of Waterloo became the stage for one of the most famous battles in history. Napoleon's army, though weary and outnumbered, faced the forces of the Duke of Wellington and the Prussians under Marshal Blücher. The stakes could not have been higher. One victory might restore his empire, but one defeat would end it forever. The battle raged from dawn to dusk. Napoleon's men fought bravely, smashing into the British lines, but Wellington held firm behind strong defensive positions. Mud and rain slowed the French advance, delaying their attacks and sapping their strength. By late afternoon, the French cavalry charged again and again, but could not break the enemy's squares. When Napoleon committed his elite Imperial Guard, the veterans who had never known defeat, they too were repelled. The cry went up, "La Garde recule!" The Guard retreats. Panic spread through the French ranks. As the sun set, Blücher's Prussians arrived, crashing into Napoleon's flank. Surrounded and overwhelmed, the once invincible French army crumbled. Waterloo marked the end of Napoleon's dreams of empire. The emperor who had dominated Europe for 2 decades was defeated, not just by superior numbers, but by fate itself.
After Waterloo, Napoleon surrendered to the British, hoping for mercy. Instead, he was exiled to the remote island of Saint Helena in the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from Europe. It was a barren, windswept rock in the middle of the ocean,
a far cry from the palaces and battlefields where he once ruled. Guarded by British soldiers and warships, he lived under constant surveillance. His world shrank to a few rooms at Longwood House, damp, uncomfortable, and isolated. The man who had once commanded millions now paced in gardens no bigger than a field. Yet Napoleon's mind remained sharp. He spent his days dictating memoirs, rewriting the story of his life as he wanted history to remember it. He reflected on his victories, justified his failures, and crafted the legend of the fallen emperor. His writings turned him into a martyr in the eyes of many Europeans, especially the French. Though weakened by illness and cut off from power, he still spoke like a ruler, planning, dreaming, and analyzing battles long past. In his isolation, Napoleon shaped not just the memory of his reign, but the myth that would endure long after his death.
On May 5th, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died on Saint Helena at the age of 51. The official cause was recorded as stomach cancer, the same illness that had claimed his father. But ever since, rumors of poisoning, plots, and slow assassination by his captors have lingered. His hair, later tested, was found to contain high levels of arsenic, fueling the mystery. In his final days, weakened and bedridden, he dictated his will. His last words were said to be, "France, l'armée, Josephine," a final tribute to his country, his soldiers, and the woman he once loved. Napoleon was buried on Saint Helena in a simple grave without his name, only "Here lies" inscribed. Yet 2 decades later, in 1840, his remains were returned to France in a grand procession. Crowds filled Paris as his coffin was placed beneath the dome of Les Invalides, where he rests to this day. His legacy remains one of the most complex in history. To some, he was a tyrant who brought endless war. To others, a genius who spread revolutionary ideals and reshaped Europe. His legal code, reforms, and vision of meritocracy influenced nations worldwide. Napoleon, the boy from Corsica who rose to become Emperor of France, left behind more than an empire. He left a legend, one of ambition, brilliance, and downfall that still captivates the world.
Napoleon's words were as sharp as his sword. His quotes reveal the mind of a man consumed by ambition, strategy, and destiny. Impossible is a word to be found only in the dictionary of fools. A soldier will fight long and hard for a bit of colored ribbon. History is the version of past events that people have decided to agree upon. Glory is fleeting, but obscurity is forever. If you want a thing done well, do it yourself. The battlefield is a scene of constant chaos. The winner will be the one who controls that chaos, both his own and the enemy's. Never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake. A leader is a dealer in hope. Men are moved by 2 levers only: fear and self-interest. Courage isn't having the strength to go on. It is going on when you don't have the strength. These words still echo today, offering glimpses into the philosophy of a man who rose from obscurity to rule Europe and whose legend still stirs debate between tyranny, ingenious, destruction, and vision.